So the previous clip we talked about the need to rethink the labels and categories of migrations and migrants. And then my question is now, so how does the reality of mixed migration complicate theoretical and conceptual understandings of forced migration?
Okay, well, for instance, if you look at refugee studies as a discipline, right, an academic discipline of specifically looking at refugees as a phenomenon, it starts with the notion of force. So people are forced against their will or desire from their regions of origin or their place of habitation, and they cross a boundary, go to another country or another sovereign space, and that means they are in need of confirmation of their, let's say, situation. And so interventions aimed at protecting refugees are situated around that problematic. They say these people are in need, they are outside of their own, let's say, governmental protection, and then organizations like the UN Refugee Organization comes in to play that role, or the government of the host country comes in and accepts people on their territory on the basis of that force. So basically there is a certain, it's not really victimization, but there is a reasonable, let's say, reasonable cause for people to be outside of their place of origin because of an external factor. If we start to call into question that the let's say that rigid idea of being a refugee, then that whole chain of reasoning becomes problematic, right? If we start to accord, let's say, choice or strategy towards somebody who claims to be a refugee or who chooses to go away from his country of origin because he or she wants to migrate to another area, but uses the language of being in need as a refugee and so on and so forth, then that notion of force becomes more and more hollow. And with that, let's say, the legitimization of accepting a person like that in new regimes of intervention or of protection, or in other countries. And conversely, within the more general migration debate, this notion of force is a little bit more lacking. So there is, and I would say encapsulated within the notion of the economic migrant, that starts out with the idea of force. Somebody is not threatened per se in life, but maybe poor, or maybe having more expectations in terms of education or livelihoods or whatever, and tries his or her way into another situation. But there is not this notion of force that, let's say, sustains the necessity to intervene or to assist a person. So what mixed migration in that sense does is that it calls for new ways of understanding what the underlying motives or rationales of forced migrants are, and how they are, let's say, how they don't match with our current ideas of responding to refugee crisis. A good example, for instance, would be large-scale refugee camps that are designed for people that fall outside of the protection of their own country, but are not, let's say, accepted by countries of asylum within their normal territory. So they are relegated to marginal spaces of control. A refugee camp is an architecture of control, which are designed functionally on a temporary basis to accommodate temporary needs, right? So people are within that camp space, they get food, they get health, they get maybe a level of education, until the reasons that made them flee in the first place cease to exist, and then they can be brought back home. So here you see that notion of force legitimizes a new, rather rigid enclosure of people within that camp setting, on that temporary, let's say, understanding of a crisis or an emergency. So this element of force, or the lack of, let's say, strategy or will, is part and parcel of that very response. But increasingly, not only because refugee situations become more long-term, hence camps become more long term, that is also called into question, right? To how long can we, first of all, how long can we call a camp a temporary construction? And secondly, if crisis normalizes on the ground, like in the countries of origin, how long can we talk about those situations as, let's say, an emergency crisis? So these camps, based on that notion of force, based on a rather rigid understanding of refugees outside of their home country, become problematic by definition as time goes on.